The fluorescent lights buzz above the trauma bay at Seattle General like a hive of insects trapped in plastic. Tuesday morning, 6:33 a.m., and Ashley Cooper moves through the controlled chaos of shift change with the kind of invisible efficiency that makes her disappear into the beige walls and chrome equipment. Her scrubs are blue, unremarkable. Her badge reads A. Cooper, RN, with no credentials marked below the name. Nobody looks twice. The ER at Norfolk's teaching hospital runs on a precise rhythm, and she knows every beat. She's been here 8 months, long enough to be trusted, not long enough to be questioned. Her hands move across the supply cart with the economy of motion that comes from muscle memory that had nothing to do with civilian nursing school and everything to do with field stations in Kandahar where the morphine ran out 3 hours before the next supply bird landed. She reaches for a 14-gauge angiocath before the resident even opens his mouth, already moving toward the next trauma bay before the attending finishes barking orders. The limp in her left leg barely shows when she's moving fast, a slight hesitation on stairs that could be old athletic injury, nothing more. Her hands never shake. They're steady as surgical lasers, scarred in places that don't match the official record, the thin white lines on her palms invisible unless someone knows to look for them. Dr. Mercer knows to look. He's standing at the nurse's station when she returns from the supply room, his posture angled so he can observe her without seeming to. 38 years old, John Hopkins pedigree, the kind of face that comes from 3 generations of money and 1 generation of ego. His white coat probably cost more than her monthly rent, tailored, spotless, with Dr. M. Mercer embroidered in gold thread below his name. Everything about him announces privilege before he speaks. He's watching her now, jaw tightening as she passes, and she feels the weight of his attention like a pressure change in the room. She doesn't acknowledge it. She's practiced this for 8 months, the art of being present without being visible, the art of command disguised as compliance. The morning briefing has already passed. She'd sat in the back row during the 6:15 a.m. huddle, listening to the attending outline the day's admissions and capacity issues, listening to the residents present their overnight cases. Nobody had asked her opinion. Nobody had made eye contact. That's how it works for nurses in teaching hospitals, especially nurses without the framed credentials on their walls, nurses who came up through the ranks instead of being born into them. Ashley has a master's in nursing from the University of Washington that nobody here has ever seen. She also has a tactical medicine certification from JSOC that she'll never mention, and 17 years of field experience that would terrify the administration if they knew. 8 months at Seattle General, and she's still invisible. That's the entire point. That's the job. The new admission comes through at 7:22 a.m., and the controlled chaos sharpens into focus. Marine Corporal James Reeves, 23 years old, shrapnel laceration to the left leg during a training exercise. Blunt force trauma with possible compartment syndrome. He's conscious, alert, complaining about the pain in the tone of someone who learned to compartmentalize suffering a long time ago. She recognizes that tone. She's heard it in mirrors. Dr. Mercer takes the case, naturally. The attending assigns it to him without comment, and Mercer moves with the kind of fluid confidence that comes from never being told no. His hands are soft. Clean. Manicured, actually. Ashley notices this from across the room as she sets up the instrument tray for suturing, arranging the materials in a sequence that an observer might find odd. Suture first, then the irrigation fluid, then the gauze. Backwards from standard protocol. But the sequence makes sense if you're thinking about trauma, about the way you move when you're working in a field tent with rounds coming through the canvas, about efficiency measured in seconds instead of comfort. Mercer arrives at the bedside with an entourage of residents trailing behind him like pilot fish. He's already narrating the case, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone explaining something complex to people he assumes are less intelligent. Laceration pattern suggests high-velocity impact, he's saying, gesturing at the wound. We'll need to evaluate the tibialis anterior for functional integrity before any closure. Nurses, I'll need a proper instrument tray. Not whatever assembly you've put together back there. Ashley doesn't react. She moves to the bedside with the tray, and Mercer glances at it with an expression of barely concealed disdain, then does a double take. She's arranged everything he'll need in exactly the sequence he would use, but arranged it backwards from standard, arranged it the way surgeons arrange instruments in combat zones, the way that shaves minutes off procedure time. She watches him realize this and watch him misinterpret it. He probably thinks she read his mind. He'll never consider that she's simply faster because she's done this under actual fire. "This will do," he says, the words grudging. The procedure takes 12 minutes. Mercer is competent, she'll grant him that. His sutures are clean, his technique solid, his understanding of tissue layers textbook perfect. Everything about his work screams expensive training and thousands of hours of practice on simulators and cadavers. He's very good at this. He's just never done it for real. Ashley stands beside the bed, holding retraction, watching the wound. The antiseptic smell is sharp in her nostrils, that institutional bleach and something chemical odor that never quite touches the blood underneath. The overhead light is harsh, unforgiving, nothing like the green glow of a tactical headlamp in a supply tent. She keeps her hand steady, keeps her breathing even, keeps her expression blank. This is not Kandahar. This is Seattle General in Norfolk, Virginia, United States of America, and she's just a nurse in blue scrubs with a badge that says RN and a limp that nobody's supposed to notice. Mercer finishes the closure with a final knot, and Corporal Reeves lets out a careful breath. The young Marine's eyes move to Ashley's hands for just a moment, and something shifts in his expression. Recognition. The kind of recognition that only comes from someone who's seen this technique before, in places where technique mattered more than credentials. "That's a Kandahar stitch," Reeves whispers, his voice so quiet it barely carries across the wound site. Not to Mercer. To her. "Who taught you to sew like that?" The room doesn't go silent. The machines keep beeping, the ventilators keep whooshing, the fluorescent lights keep their relentless buzz. But Ashley's hand still for exactly one heartbeat. One moment where the 8 months of invisibility, the careful construction of the cover identity, the mission parameters that demand she be nobody, all compress into a single breath. She doesn't look at Reeves. She doesn't change her expression. She finishes repositioning the bandage over the closed wound and steps back from the bedside with the same efficiency she's maintained all morning. "Just read the textbook," she says, her voice flat, measured, careful. Excellent blood supply in the leg. You want closure that reduces infection risk. It's not untrue. It's just not the whole truth. Mercer is wrapping up now, already moving toward the next case, already done with Reeves, already done with the procedure. The resident team trails behind him like they're attached by invisible wire, and the attending appears to document the closure. Nobody else heard what Reeves said. Nobody else saw the recognition flicker across the Marine's young face, the understanding that he'd just been sutured closed by someone whose hands had done this before in places that didn't have trauma bays or attending physicians or Johns Hopkins-trained surgeons with manicured fingernails. The morning stretches into afternoon, and the ER cycles through its rhythm. Chest pain in Bay 3, ankle fracture in Bay 5, gastroenteritis in the waiting room taking up space. Ashley moves through it all with her limp and her steady hands and her invisible efficiency. She takes her break at 12:27 p.m. in the staff locker room, opening her locker to grab her lunch container from the back. The jacket hangs on the hook where she left it, civilian clothes, the kind of thing no one thinks twice about. She reaches past it, careful not to disturb the small rectangle of fabric stitched into the lining, the faded unit patch with its insignia barely visible after 8 months of being hidden from view. She doesn't touch it. She just confirms it's still there, still secure, still a secret. Dr. Mercer is waiting at the nurse's station when she comes back, and this is where the temperature of the day begins to change. She feels it like the shift in pressure before a storm. He's standing with his arms crossed, watching her approach, and his eyes have that particular intensity that comes from someone who's finally noticed something they can't quite dismiss. He's surrounded by staff, by residents, by junior nurses who immediately find urgent reasons to be elsewhere when he settles his attention on something. The break room clears within seconds. This is natural, the way a room parts in front of someone with institutional power. Ashley, Mercer says, and the use of her first name is a weapon. I wanted to commend your tray setup this morning. Very intuitive. The compliment is lined with something else, something sharp underneath. Ashley nods once, accepting the praise as a nurse accepts praise from a doctor, with gratitude and deference. She doesn't explain how the tray setup comes from hundreds of hours in field stations, how it comes from muscle memory that learned its lessons before she ever put on a civilian scrub. She simply inclines her head. Thank you, Dr. Mercer. Glad I could help. She moves past him toward the next task, toward the admission on the way in, toward the structure of her day that has held for 8 months without fracture. What she doesn't see, what she doesn't need to see, is the moment his eyes narrow as she moves away, the moment something crystallizes behind his expression, the moment a man with significant institutional power begins to wonder exactly who he's standing next to. But that wasn't the worst part. The real problem walks through the front doors of Seattle General at 8:14 p.m., when the evening shift is reaching its peak and the ER is running at 118% capacity. A gray-haired man in an expensive suit, escorted by hospital administration, heading directly for the surgical wing. His name is on Ashley's mission parameters. She's been waiting 8 months for him to arrive, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the evidence of the medical supply theft ring to be complete enough to act on. The one patient, the one case, the one connection to the entire network of diversions funneling resources to operatives across 3 continents. He's finally here. And she has no idea what's about to happen. The morning briefing at Seattle General started at 6:45, before the day shift properly consumed the emergency department. Ashley Cooper stood at the periphery of the gathered nurses and residents, her report folder tucked against her ribs, waiting her turn to present the overnight admits. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric monotone above, casting everything in that particular shade of pale that made even healthy people look vaguely unwell. She'd been awake for 38 hours straight, first her overnight shift, then staying to observe a trauma consult, then arriving early to prepare notes. Most people would look exhausted. Ashley looked exactly the same as she always did, present, measured, invisible. Dr. Mercer stood at the head of the conference table like a general at war, his white coat pristine, his Rolex catching the fluorescent light with the deliberate gleam of something expensive. He was talking about overnight census when Ashley's turn came, his eyes drifting toward her with the expression of a man who'd just noticed an insect crawling across his desk. Interesting technique you used yesterday, Nurse Cooper, he called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of the room like a knife through silk. That 3-layer closure on the trauma admit. Quite detailed. The resident straightened. Someone's pen stopped moving. Where exactly did you train? Community college? Online certification program? The room compressed. That's what it felt like, the oxygen suddenly thinner, the space between people tightening into a stranglehold. Ashley's jaw moved once, a single muscle contraction visible only to those watching for it. Her voice emerged level, each word placed like surgical sutures, standard protocol from nursing school. Seattle University, 2009. Interesting, Mercer said, turning to the resident beside him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Most people who graduate from a 4-year program don't develop their own closure variants on their second week. The residents laughed, nervous, complicit, the sound of predators recognizing a stronger predator's kill. Might want to stick with what they actually taught you. Ashley completed her report, 3 admits, 2 stable, 1 pending imaging. No tremor in her voice. No defensiveness. Just facts, delivered like a woman reading inventory. When she finished, she stepped back from the table and waited for dismissal, her hands at her sides, her posture unchanged. If her fingers had curled slightly, becoming small fists for 3 seconds before opening again, no one was watching closely enough to notice. But Dr. Mercer was watching. He was always watching now. By the end of that first week, the nickname had spread through the department like infection through a wound. "Hey protocol," he'd call out when she passed him in the hallway, his voice dripping with something between contempt and amusement. "Protocol, got a minute?" The residents echoed it back to each other. One of the senior nurses, a woman named Chen who'd worked alongside Ashley for 6 months without real friction, started using it too. Protocol needs to grab those gauze packs. The word itself became weaponized, no longer a reference to medical procedures but to Ashley's presumed rigidity, her lack of imagination, her inability to think beyond the handbook. Ashley didn't respond. She received the messages, registered them as information about her social status within the unit, and filed them away with the same detachment she applied to spotting early sepsis markers in blood work. Protocol. The name had no power if she refused to acknowledge its intention. Pain was information. This was just information. By week 2, Dr. Mercer had escalated. Tuesday morning, shift change at 7 a.m., the unit board posted its daily assignments and notifications. The evening staff gathered around the wooden frame, 8 nurses, 2 techs, a medical student on rotation. That's when Ashley saw it, a laminated white card affixed to the board in Dr. Mercer's precise handwriting. Her name. A patient ID, 447. And beneath it, typed in the hospital's red font protocol notation for violations, deviation from standard wound closure procedure. Non-approved suturing technique applied without physician authorization. Requires corrective training and immediate adherence to established hospital protocols. Initials required. The room had the peculiar quality of held breath. A patient's family member, a young woman maybe 30, standing with an elderly man who must have been the patient's father, watched from the waiting area 10 feet away, watching a nurse be publicly documented as failing. Nurse Cooper, Dr. Mercer called from across the ER, his voice pitched to carry. Initial here, please. He gestured to the board with the kind of exaggerated formality reserved for demonstrating authority. Wouldn't want anyone thinking we don't take protocol seriously. Ashley moved toward the board. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. She collected the pen he offered, a expensive Mont Blanc, the kind of pen that felt heavier than it should, weighted with someone's need to assert superiority through objects. She initialed the violation with careful precision, AC, date, time. The pen didn't shake. Her signature didn't waver. She returned the pen to Dr. Mercer with a nod that was neither subservient nor defiant, simply professional acknowledgement of a transaction completed. What nobody saw except Ashley herself was that when she turned back toward the medication cart, her knuckles, wrapped around the cool metal handle, went white. Bloodless. The pressure she applied would have bent aluminum. She held that grip for 3 seconds, feeling the sharp edge of the handle bite into her palms, using the pain like an anchor. Then she released it. Her hands fell back to normal color. She returned to work. That evening, when she finally sat down in the break room at 9:30, collapsing into one of the plastic chairs that always seemed designed to make sitting as uncomfortable as possible, she had the space exactly 47 seconds before someone noticed. Chen came in first, saw Ashley's lunch box open on the small table, saw Ashley reaching for a container of rice and vegetables that probably smelled like Tuesday afternoon in a hospital locker. Chen's entire body performed a pantomime of suddenly remembering something urgent. Oh, I need to check on labs. She turned and left. Within seconds, the break room emptied like a sinking ship. A young nurse named Okafor, who'd once asked Ashley for advice on pediatric for placement, simply stood up and walked out. Someone's cup of coffee sat steaming on the counter, abandoned. The room went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, its compressor cycling in the way that sounded like a man struggling to breathe. Ashley ate her rice. She didn't taste it. She was alone in the space, but she wouldn't call it loneliness because that word implied someone cared about isolation when the actual information was far simpler. She was radioactive now. Dr. Mercer's contempt had made touching her contagious to the staff. They'd absorbed his assessment and distributed it through the unit like a virus. The quiet nurse who didn't defend herself, who didn't joke or complain or drink happy hour cocktails with the group, who somehow knew things about medicine that made the residents uncomfortable, she wasn't worth the risk of his public disdain. She understood this because she'd seen similar systems before. Hierarchy. Status. The brutal mathematics of survival in a pack structure. She'd operated inside military hierarchies where the same rules applied, except with clearer rules and less pretense. At least in Kandahar, people had been honest about the pecking order. 6 more shifts passed. 6 more times sitting alone in the break room. 6 more times watching conversation stop when she entered a room and resume when she left, the sound resuming like someone had turned the volume back on a television. The nurses' stations became territories she could access only for work. The camaraderie she'd observed during her first 2 weeks, the shared exhaustion, the gallows humor, the small kindnesses passed between people who held each other's lives in balance every shift, that world had closed its doors. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Dr. Mercer's whispered campaign during staff meetings and shift changes, spreading through the unit like contaminated water through a system. You know what I heard? She turned down the surgical rotation. Probably because she knows she'd be exposed, lack of actual credentials. Or, I looked into her background. No real trauma experience. Just watched YouTube videos, apparently. The rumors rippled outward, each retelling gathering new details, new interpretations. By the 3rd week, half the unit believed Ashley had fabricated her credentials. The other half simply didn't care enough to question Dr. Mercer's assessment. That Thursday, during a cardiac arrest in Bay 3, a patient's arrhythmia deteriorated into full ventricular fibrillation. The monitor screamed its warning in 3-second intervals, the electrical signal that meant the heart had given up coherent function. Ashley was already moving, already positioning herself at the patient's left side to begin compressions when Dr. Mercer appeared, not beside her, but directly in front of her, his shoulder driving her sideways with a force that felt personal, purposeful. "Let someone competent handle this," he said, not quiet enough to be private, loud enough to ensure the entire bay heard the implication clearly. Ashley stepped back. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't elevate. She simply stepped back and watched Dr. Mercer's compressions, noting immediately that his hand position was slightly high, technically correct, but not optimal for generating the kind of pressure that actually reopened collapsed vessels. She could have corrected him. She could have stepped back in, hands moving naturally into position, her muscle memory from field work in Kandahar taking over. She didn't. She stood 3 feet away and watched, her hands curled at her sides, feeling the tremor that wasn't fear but restraint, the weight of years of training compressed into muscles that wanted to move but held still. The training wasn't physical. It was the much harder training of knowing when to act and when to absorb the blow without reaction. The patient converted after 6 minutes of compressions and 2 rounds of epinephrine. The sinus rhythm returned to the monitor like a miracle, and Dr. Mercer accepted the relief of the ICU team as though he'd single-handedly defied death itself. As though the compressions that worked were his alone. Ashley didn't feel vindicated. She felt erased. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon during her 7th shift of the stretch, a Marine corporal named James Reeves came through triage with a shrapnel laceration from a training accident, nothing life-threatening, but deep, multiple layers, the kind of wound that required precision closure to minimize scarring. He was young, maybe 24, with the particular bearing of someone who'd been trained to move through the world with purpose. Ashley prepped the site with antiseptic, draping the sterile field, positioning the high-intensity lamp. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, equipment selection, site inspection, mental calculation of depth and structural integrity. She selected a 3.0 silk suture and began the first layer closure, her needle passing through tissue with the precise angle and depth that came from training and muscle memory accumulated over years. This wasn't YouTube technique. This was field thoracotomy with a combat knife, upgraded to civilian equipment. This was the hands of someone who'd learned to sew human beings back together in conditions where failure meant someone's daughter didn't come home. The needle moved. The suture pulled. The tissue approximated in that satisfying way that meant the closure would hold, would heal clean, would leave minimal scarring. She completed the first layer and began the second, switching to a smaller gauge, her movements economical and practiced. Reeves went absolutely still. Not the stillness of anesthesia or sedation, but something else, the alertness of someone recognizing something true beneath the surface. His eyes locked onto her hands, tracking every movement, watching not just what she was doing but how she was doing it. The precision. The confidence. The absolute absence of hesitation. "That's a Kandahar stitch," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. I've seen that before. Who taught you? Ashley didn't pause. Her hands continued their measured work, pulling the suture tight, positioning for the third layer. Watched a lot of YouTube videos, she said quietly, her voice flat, offering nothing. Reeves didn't look convinced. He kept watching her hands, his expression shifting through something that looked like confusion and then recognition, like he was solving a puzzle but getting pieces that didn't match the box the puzzle came in. But he didn't push it. When she finished the final layer, a continuous subcuticular closure that left almost no external marks, just a clean line of healing, he lay still, staring at her face like she was a map to something he couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he said finally, and there was something in his voice that suggested he meant more than just the wound care. Ashley didn't respond. She removed the gloves with practiced efficiency and documented the closure in his chart. By evening, Reeves had been discharged with aftercare instructions. By the next shift, he'd become just another patient moving through the system. The Kandahar stitch disappeared back into obscurity, another technique no one was supposed to recognize in a hospital in Norfolk where night nurses were supposed to stay invisible. But something had shifted. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was there. She'd let someone see. Just for a moment, she'd stopped hiding well enough to be seen. She didn't know it yet, but that moment had consequences. That moment had an expiration date measured in hours. The gunman crashed through the ER doors at 11:36 p.m. on a Tuesday, his voice raw with desperation and rage. He had a Glock 17 and a need that had calcified into violence. The pistol swept across the waiting area like a scythe, indiscriminate and terrible. Patients scattered. A mother grabbed her child. Security froze behind the check-in desk, hands rising slowly, palms out, speaking the language of de-escalation that everyone knew wouldn't work. Corporal James Reeves sat in the plastic chair near the window, his left leg elevated on a cushioned stool, waiting for x-rays that would confirm what he already knew: stress fracture, minor. He'd be back to PT in 2 weeks. He'd been watching the rain streak the glass when the doors burst open. His instinct came first, 22 years old but with the reflexes of someone who had worn a uniform in Helmand Province. He didn't run. He watched. The gunman screamed for oxycodone. Fentanyl. Anything. His hands shook and his eyes had the flat desperation of addiction compressed into a single explosive moment. He wasn't looking at the Marine. Not yet. He was gesturing at the triage nurse, at the waiting area, at the indifference of a hospital that kept pills locked behind white plastic and clinical protocols. But then his eyes found Reeves, young, male, sitting alone, waiting. An easy target. A witness. The barrel swung toward Reeves's head. Ashley was 3 hallways away when she heard the commotion. She heard it the way a combat medic hears incoming, not just sound but information, data compressed into gunshots and screams and the specific silence that comes before everything changes. Her hands were holding a patient's discharge paperwork when her body made a decision her conscious mind didn't have time to ratify. She moved. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as she crossed the threshold into the waiting area. The gunman had locked his sights on Reeves. The Marine's eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, recognition, warning, acceptance. Ashley didn't hesitate. She stepped between them, her left shoulder angled slightly forward, her hands at chest height, her body a shield that had spent 8 years learning how to absorb impact. Her muscle memory was louder than her reason. Kandahar screamed through her nervous system. The field hospital outside forward operating base Shank. Rounds coming through the corrugated metal walls. The choice to stand between the wounded and the incoming fire because sometimes that was the only protocol that mattered. The first bullet hit her left shoulder, splintering bone, tearing through the deltoid muscle with the specific violence of point-blank gunfire. The impact spun her slightly sideways but her feet stayed planted. She didn't flinch. She didn't step back. The second bullet struck her upper chest, just left of center. She felt it like a hammer blow delivered by someone who understood structural damage. Her ribs fractured, she heard them crack, felt the sharp complaint of her body. She stayed in place. The third bullet followed a millisecond later, penetrating deeper, finding her left lung. The hiss of air escaping. Blood flooding into the pleural space. She should have gone down. Her body was screaming at her to go down. Instead, she held her ground, her eyes on the gunman, her shoulders square, refusing to let him see anything except her commitment to the Marine behind her. The fourth bullet tore through her abdomen, perforating her small intestine, shredding the mesentery, flooding her peritoneal cavity with blood that wouldn't stop coming. Pain was information. Pain was data. Her hands didn't move. Her expression didn't crack. The fifth bullet shattered her right hip, fragmenting the femoral head, severing the blood vessels that fed that joint. Her leg gave out. She collapsed to the linoleum, her blood spreading across the floor in a pool that reflected the fluorescent lights like a dark mirror, and she stayed conscious long enough to see security grab the gunman, to hear Reeves screaming her name, to register that the Marine was alive. Then the edges went grey. She woke in recovery 3 days later with her daughter holding her hand. Maya was 7 years old and terrified and trying very hard not to cry. She had her mother's eyes, dark, serious, holding more information than a 7-year-old should have to carry. She sat in the plastic chair beside the hospital bed with her legs swinging because they didn't reach the floor, and her small hand gripped Ashley's with surprising strength. "Hi, baby," Ashley whispered. Her voice came out like gravel. Her throat was raw from intubation. Her entire left side was numb and screaming simultaneously, a contradiction that her brain was still processing. "I'm okay. You were sleeping for a long time." Maya's voice was small and formal, the way children spoke when they were holding themselves together with concentrated effort. "The doctor said you got hurt." "I know. But I'm here now. I'm awake." The machines around her beeped their mechanical rhythm. The ventilator had been removed hours earlier, and now she was breathing on her own, shallow breaths because anything deeper sent sharp signals from her fractured ribs. Her left arm was immobilized. Her right hip was wrapped in surgical dressing. She had been gutted and reassembled, and the surgeons had done their work with the precision that kept people alive when the alternative was unthinkable. The termination letter sat on the bedside table. She saw it while Maya was in the bathroom. Saw it and read it and understood the specific cruelty of timing that had waited until she woke up, until consciousness made firing her a fully realized consequence rather than an abstract administrative action. The letter was printed on hospital letterhead. It was dated the morning after she'd been brought in, which meant Dr. Mercer had filed it while she was still in surgery, while her body was on the operating table and her blood was being suctioned from her abdomen and her fractured ribs were being splintered by the surgeon's careful hands. Section 14.7. Staff Safety Protocols During Active Threat Situations. She read the language that condemned her. Reckless endangerment. Failure to follow lockdown procedures. Unauthorized intervention creating liability exposure. A pattern of protocol deviation. 3 prior write-ups attached, each one a small stone placed deliberately in a wall designed to bury her. He hadn't even been in the operating room when she'd been saved. He had been at the nurse's station, pulling manuals, his hands moving through pages like he was constructing a coffin out of institutional policy. Every sentence calculated. Every regulation weaponized. The gun had been his but the bullets had been hers, 5 of them, lodged inside her body, and he had used her sacrifice against her. The irony was sharp enough to taste like blood. She had stepped in front of that Marine because her training was deeper than her thinking. Because the choice was instinctive, automatic, the response of someone who had spent 8 years learning that some things mattered more than protocol. She had taken 5 bullets and collapsed into a pool of her own blood, and Reeves was alive, and somewhere in the criminal justice system, the gunman was being processed and charged and the shooting was being classified as a justified intervention by hospital personnel. But she was terminated. She was fired from the only position that gave her access to the patient in room for 12, the one with the redacted name and the complicated medical history and the connection to the supply theft ring she had spent 8 months investigating from inside Seattle General. He was scheduled for preoperative blood work tomorrow. The evidence she needed was embedded in the hospital's electronic medical record system, protected by her staff access credentials. Without that access, the mission died. Without that access, the investigation went nowhere and the medical supplies continued flowing to the operatives and the network she was supposed to dismantle remained intact. One Marine saved. One 8-month operation destroyed. She held the termination letter in her right hand, the hand that still worked, and looked at her daughter when Maya returned from the bathroom. "Mommy, why are you home early?" Maya asked, not understanding that this was the question that would stay with Ashley for the next 72 hours. "Why are you home early?" As if this was a normal thing, as if her mother had simply left work, as if the letter didn't represent the collapse of everything she had spent months building. Ashley folded the letter and set it on the bedside table. She looked at her daughter's face, the worry lines that shouldn't exist on a 7-year-old, and she did something she had trained herself never to do in public. She told her child the truth. "Work is going to look a little different for a while, sweetie," Ashley said quietly. "But that's okay. We're going to be okay." The words felt like a lie. The words felt like promise. The words felt like the beginning of something she didn't yet have language to name. The termination letter sat on the bedside table like an accusation. Ashley's eyes tracked across the words for what felt like the 100th time, each one landing with the precision of a surgical strike: reckless endangerment, failure to follow protocol, liability the hospital could no longer afford. The letterhead bore yesterday's date. Effective immediately. 3 days. 72 hours since the gunman's 5th bullet found her hip, since her body had become a shield between Corporal Reeves and a spray of lead that would have taken his head clean off. 72 hours since Dr. Mercer had begun constructing this paper architecture of her professional destruction while she bled out in OR 3, her hand steady in a field thoracotomy that would have impressed any combat surgeon, though no one would ever know that part. The discharge nurse had wheeled her out at 2 in the afternoon. Protocols demanded after hip reconstruction, and Ashley had refused the chair anyway, standing on the leg with grim determination that made the physical therapist wince. Pain was information. Pain was data. The hip screamed its damage in a language only her body understood: 3 compression screws, 1 titanium plate, 6 weeks minimum before weight-bearing without assistance. She'd signed the discharge papers with her left hand, her right arm immobilized in a sling that felt like surrender. Maya had asked questions on the drive home, her small voice threading with confusion. "Mommy, why does your shoulder have a big bandage? Why can't you use your arm?" Ashley had kept her eyes forward on Norfolk's grey afternoon traffic, navigating each response with the same precision she'd once used to navigate Kandahar's claymores and IED-laden roads. Children understood only what you told them, nothing more, nothing less. She'd said something about an accident at work, something about needing to rest, something that dissolved into white noise as they pulled into the driveway. The kitchen table had become her territory by 4 o'clock. Still in the discharge scrubs, too painful to change, each movement a negotiation with her reconstructed body, Ashley sat with the termination letter spread before her like evidence. Her medication bottles lined the table's edge, oxycodone she refused to take, ibuprofen in quantities that wouldn't touch the deep bone ache, antibiotics to prevent infection in wounds that still wept clear fluid through their dressings. And in her other hand, the thing that broke her more than any letter could, the faded unit patch from her jacket lining, the 3rd Medical Battalion insignia worn nearly threadbare from 8 months of her fingers finding it in her pocket, touching it in supply closets, grounding herself against the weight of her own invisibility. She'd maintained perfect composure through Mercer's humiliations, through the way his voice dripped contempt when he read her write-up aloud to the entire trauma team, through the break room that cleared the moment she entered it. Never defended herself. Never revealed her rank. Never pushed back with anything but professional courtesy that functioned like a shield, turning every insult away without acknowledgement. That was the mission protocol. Stay invisible. Stay embedded. Protect the perimeter from inside. 8 months of watching Dr. Mercer's behavior patterns, cross-referencing them against DEA intelligence about pharmaceutical supply chains. 8 months of accessing the medical record system during her shifts, filing away details about which medications disappeared from inventory during which shifts, which staff members logged access to restricted areas at odd hours, which delivery manifests didn't align with hospital documentation. The trail led to supply theft funneling opioids and other controlled substances to a network that the Pentagon suspected was feeding resources to operatives in the Middle East. The investigation required a nurse with unquestioned access, someone embedded so deeply in the daily operations that no one questioned her presence in secure areas. And then a Marine with a gun and a desperate need for pills had ended it all in 90 seconds of violence. The tears came silently, something she'd trained herself never to do in public, but her daughter wasn't home yet. Maya was at her grandmother's until 6, had been dropped there this morning before the discharge appointment, had no idea her mother was coming home broken and jobless and investigatively compromised. Ashley let her shoulders shake with suppressed sobs, her good arm pressed against the table, the unit patch crumpled in her fist. The sobs came from the place beneath her ribs where officers learned to bury their emotions, the place where grief and rage liquefied into something too heavy to hold upright. 18 minutes until Maya's grandmother dropped her off. 18 minutes to compose herself, to rebuild the mask, to become the kind of mother who could answer questions about why Mommy was crying without explaining that her cover was blown, her mission was dead, her entire 8-month infiltration had collapsed the moment she chose to be human instead of invisible. The letter sat there promising that Seattle General would provide no severance, no reference, no explanation except the one Mercer had written, a liability, a protocol violator, a nurse too reckless to employ. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the suspect, the gray-haired man she'd been monitoring, whose supply chain connections led all the way back to a network the Pentagon had classified as a legitimate threat, was still out there. Still operational. Still moving medications and money through channels that Seattle General had been her window into. With her terminated, with her access revoked, the investigation would stall. Weeks of work, months of embedded observation, would evaporate like sweat under Kandahar heat. The doorbell rang at 8:15. Ashley ignored it, kept her face forward, kept her breathing steady. The tears had stopped by then, had been locked back down where they belonged, though her eyes still felt raw and her chest still moved with the aftershocks of something breaking deep inside. The doorbell rang again. And again, with the persistence of someone who wouldn't accept silence as an answer. She limped to the door with her new cane, every step a negotiation with the hip reconstruction that screamed its displeasure at weight-bearing. Her right arm remained immobilized, her shoulder wound tight beneath the sling, her body moving with the careful precision of someone handling damaged equipment. She yanked the door open with irritation that was really exhaustion wearing the mask of anger. Corporal Reeves stood in her doorway in dress blue so crisp they could cut glass, his uniform bearing the insignia of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse, the unit that had first recognized her in Kandahar. His eyes held something between gratitude and knowing, the look of a man who understood exactly what she'd done and exactly what it had cost him to survive it. He said quietly, his voice carrying the military precision of someone trained to communicate without excess. I made some calls. You need to come to the hospital tomorrow morning. 0900 hours. Please. Ashley opened her mouth to refuse, to explain that she was terminated, that her access was revoked, that returning to Seattle General would accomplish nothing except remind her of the professional grave she'd already dug. But Reeves was already walking away, moving back down the driveway with the measured pace of someone who delivered his orders and trusted them to be understood. The door closed quietly behind him, leaving Ashley standing in her own hallway, leaning on her cane, understanding nothing except that something was about to happen and she'd been summoned to witness it. Tomorrow morning. 0900 hours. She'd been given a time and a place, and despite everything, despite the termination letter, despite the blown cover, despite the investigation that would now stall, her body understood exactly what to do with a direct order. She would go. And whatever waited for her at Seattle General at 9 in the morning would either explain Reeves' visit or destroy what remained of the life she'd managed to build in the shadows. She stood at the ER entrance at 8:19 a.m., still wearing yesterday's clothes, her rebuilt hip aching in the cold Norfolk morning. The parking lot stretched behind her. The automatic doors hissed open. She didn't know what she was walking into. The lobby erupted at 8:52. 200 Marines in dress blues filed through the hospital entrance in synchronized precision, their boots striking tile in a rhythm that made the windows rattle. Not one conversation, not one whisper. Just the sound of dress shoes hitting polished floor like artillery fire, measured and deliberate and impossible to ignore. They parted formation down the center of the lobby in 2 perfect columns, and a gurney rolled through the gap they created, pushed by a full-dress honor guard. The man on the gurney had gray hair and haunted eyes that had seen things most people will never see twice in a lifetime. His left arm was wrapped in bandages. His jaw tightened when he saw Ashley's face. "Al-Shifa," he whispered in accented English. "Arabic." The call sign froze every Marine in earshot. "The Angel of Kandahar." Every muscle in Ashley's body went still. The scar tissue under her ribs pulled tight. This man had been classified. Buried. Buried so deep that his name existed in exactly 4 files in the entire United States government, and only 2 of those files were active. A sergeant major stepped forward, his dress uniform immaculate as a razor's edge, and opened a leather folder. When he spoke, his voice carried through the atrium like a declaration of war. "Captain Ashley Cooper. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism under fire. 17 combat saves across 3 tours in Kandahar Province, Paktika District, Sanjin Valley." Citation reads as follows: "For service above and beyond the call of duty while serving as a combat medic attached to 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, Charlie Company, operating in hostile territory. Captain Cooper demonstrated exceptional valor under direct fire, performing emergency field thoracotomies with improvised instruments, including a combat knife, when surgical facilities were unavailable. On 17 separate occasions, her actions prevented the loss of United States and Allied personnel." Dr. Mercer shouldered through the crowd, his face already red, his voice cutting the silence like broken glass. "This is absurd, she's just a—" The words died as a 2-star general stepped forward in his dress uniform, each star catching the fluorescent overhead light. The general raised his right hand to his forehead in a salute that seemed to last an eternity, and held it as a junior Marine in dress blues pinned medal clusters to Ashley's hospital gown, the one she'd been discharged in 3 days ago, still stained if you looked closely, still carrying the faint smell of antiseptic and blood. Bronze star first. Then silver star. Then 2 purple hearts, the ribbons the color of dried wine. And finally, the Navy Cross. The 2nd highest award for combat bravery in the Marine Corps. The medal that meant you had saved lives that no one else could save, that you had stayed in the fire when every instinct screamed to run, that you had looked at death and refused to let it win. The general's salute didn't drop. 200 Marines stood absolutely motionless. A man in a dark suit materialized from somewhere in the crowd, his Pentagon credentials visible on a lanyard around his neck. He stepped beside Ashley and leaned close enough that only she could hear. "Nightingale 6, he said quietly. "Your mission parameters have changed. Full briefing 1,400 hours. Classified secure room, basement level 2. Then he was gone, folding back into the crowd as if he'd never been there. Dr. Mercer's face had gone pale, the red bleeding out until his skin looked like old paper. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. The voice that came out was thin, fractured. "I didn't know," he whispered. "No," Ashley said, and her voice was different now. Deeper. Command presence like a tank engine idling. "You didn't." By that afternoon, the video was everywhere. 47 seconds of footage captured on a hospital visitor's phone, Dr. Mercer's sneering voice cutting through the sergeant major's citation. "This is absurd, she's just a—" his face contorted with contempt, his body language radiating dismissal and disdain, while 200 Marines in dress blues stood absolutely motionless behind him. The click of the general's salute. The gleam of medals being pinned to a hospital gown stained with the blood of a man who had been willing to let himself be executed rather than let the Marine Corps find out what he'd done. By evening, the video had 6 million views. By midnight, it had 17 million. The comment section was a sustained nuclear reaction. Clips of Mercer's voice, "just a nurse," played on loop across every platform. News stations ran the full footage. Cable news talking heads debated military service. Hashtags erupted. Trending. Viral. Inescapable. By morning, #just a nurse had 43 million mentions. Dr. Patricia Westfield, the attending physician from Johns Hopkins who had written Mercer's residency recommendation letters, who had vouched for his character at his hiring committee interview, who had invited him to present research at conferences, released a public statement at 7:14 a.m. on Wednesday. "I am horrified and ashamed to have ever associated my name with Dr. Mercer's career. His conduct represents everything our profession should stand against. Effective immediately, I disavow any connection to him and will be cooperating fully with all institutional board reviews. Medicine is supposed to elevate the vulnerable, not exploit them. Dr. Mercer has failed in that sacred obligation." The statement was posted to her hospital's official letterhead. Signed, "Hospitals talk to each other. Board members talk to each other. The medical community is a small galaxy, and Westfield's statement was a supernova." The Seattle General Medical Board called an emergency session for Wednesday at 1 p.m. By Wednesday at 2 p.m., they had authorized a full investigation into every complaint Mercer had ever filed, every write-up he had ever submitted, every termination he had ever recommended over his 6 years at the hospital. What they found was a pattern so clear it looked like a blueprint. Competent nurses forced out. Talented residents driven away. A culture of fear meticulously constructed. All of the departed staff shared one thing: they made Dr. Mercer look bad by being excellent at their jobs. Nurses who challenged him were reassigned. Residents who questioned his decisions were documented as unfit for trauma medicine. Staff evaluations were weaponized with surgical precision. Patient families came forward. 3 of them, then 7, then 12. Stories of dismissiveness, cruelty, of being made to feel small by a physician who needed to be the smartest person in every room. A mother whose daughter had been told her appendix pain was psychosomatic and sent home, only to return 3 days later in septic shock because the appendix had ruptured. A man whose wife's stroke symptoms had been dismissed as anxiety. A father whose son had coded because Mercer had ignored a nurse's concern about medication interaction. 3 former nurses gave formal depositions. The board review took 2 weeks. By the end of week 1, Mercer's hospital privileges had been suspended. By the end of week 2, he had been terminated for cause, his position eliminated, his attending status stripped. The medical board issued a formal reprimand that would follow his credentials for the rest of his career. No hospital in a 400-mile radius would touch him. He applied to 73 positions across the country. 73 rejections. His wife left, taking their 2 children to her mother's house in Connecticut. She filed for full custody and won. His apartment lease was not renewed. His medical malpractice insurance premium skyrocketed. His name became toxic in ways that had nothing to do with the internet and everything to do with institutional memory. 6 months later, someone spotted him teaching CPR certification courses at Norfolk Community College, his hand shaking as he demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy in a classroom that smelled of old coffee and institutional defeat. Minimum wage. Health insurance stripped. Teaching EMTs how to save lives while his own life collapsed into something unrecognizable. The video was still being shared. She returned to Seattle General on a Thursday morning in late spring, 6 months after the shooting, after the surgery, after the termination letter and the recovery and the classified briefing in basement level 2 where they told her that the supply theft ring she'd been investigating was actually a weapons diversion scheme, that her 3 days of work had uncovered a network that extended into 7 states, that arrests had already been made, that the case was closed, that her cover was no longer needed because the threat had been eliminated. Ashley Cooper walked through the ER entrance in her captain's dress uniform, the Navy Cross visible on her chest, walking without a cane though her rebuilt hip still ached when the weather turned cold. The lobby went quiet. The hospital administrator met her in the main conference room with 2 board members and a prepared statement. They offered reinstatement with full back pay. They offered a public commendation for heroism. They offered a new position in the trauma department, leading physician oversight on patient safety protocols. They offered, in careful language, their absolute horror at what had been done to her. Ashley listened to every word. "I'm not coming back as a nurse," she said quietly. The voice had changed again. Not soft. Not deferential. Command presence like a general standing in the rain without flinching. But I'll take a role training your trauma staff in combat casualty protocols. Combat medicine. Field medicine. The kind of medicine that saves lives in places where hospitals don't exist. The administrator blinked. You're willing. For 6 months. Full time. Then we evaluate. She started the following Monday. The first training class had 30 nurses, 4 physicians, and 1 Marine corporal sitting front row. Reeves had been discharged from the hospital 3 months earlier, alive because she'd stepped between him and a bullet. He'd asked to attend. The hospital had said yes. During a break on the 3rd day, a young nurse approached Ashley hesitantly. Her name was Sarah. She'd been one of the nurses who left the break room whenever Ashley sat down. The fear had been real. The retaliation from Mercer had been real. The choice between job security and basic human kindness had felt impossible. Captain Cooper. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. I was one of the nurses who... I should have. I'm sorry. I was scared of Mercer, and I... Ashley cut her off gently. Hand steady. Eyes clear. You survived a hostile work environment. That took its own kind of courage. Different kind. Just as real. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, unable to speak, and walked back to her seat. As Ashley left that evening, she paused at the ER entrance where her blood had once pooled on white linoleum, spreading in a red circle that the trauma team had worked around, that had taken 3 industrial-strength cleaning sessions to remove completely. The floor had been scrubbed clean and polished until it gleamed like glass. A plaque had been mounted on the wall beside the entrance. Brass. Permanent. The kind of memorial that hospitals install for people who change the institution's soul. It read, in honor of Captain Ashley Cooper, who demonstrated that the ones who have seen the worst often give the most. She touched it once, her fingers tracing the letters, then turned away. Her daughter Maya was waiting in the lobby, homework finished, finally understanding why her mom had been gone so much, why she came home quiet and careful, why she'd taken 5 bullets without hesitation. Why heroes sometimes looked like nurses. Why the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. They walked out into the Norfolk evening together, hand in hand, the faded unit patch now framed on the wall at home beside her decorations, a reminder that some covers are worth keeping, and some are worth breaking. If you made it this far, you understand now. You understand that the people who save lives in the quietest moments are often invisible until the moment they can't be anymore. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and leave a comment telling me which story hit you hardest. Because there are hundreds of people like Captain Cooper working in hospitals right now, carrying secrets and scars and the kind of strength that never gets recognized until everything falls apart. Let's make sure they're seen.